And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the IWR, but I was asked to talk a little bit about, I'll take a very short time on the IHDP, the International Human Dimensions Program, maybe to sort of say why we did this exercise. The idea kind of really came up when I was at UNEP, but when I moved off to IHDP, the new chair that I managed to arm twist him to accept to be the chair of the science committee of IHDP, Partha Dasgupta, sort of was one of the originators of this work, and so we thought it would be good to continue and really push and get something out as soon as possible. And it so happened that, and I'll show as I go through the slide, so a nice concept that was developed by Deepak Chopra, the spiritual chair, synchronous destiny. And it's just happened that this report came at a time when UN Secretary General was asking for something, the Sarkozy initiative, so we felt that it was good timing to have had this report. Now, what I won't do in this presentation is, so those who are mathematically, the mathematical nerds in this group, I'm not going to go through the mathematics, and I thought I will keep that aside. We didn't develop the mathematics. This was all done long before, and in fact, one of the originators of that group is sitting here in this audience right at the back, Professor Carl Goran Mehler. The other thing I won't do is go into the nitty-gritty about the actual empirical stuff, like which point, which databases, and all that stuff. That's all very well laid out in this book, and you can download this free. We managed to negotiate with Cambridge University Press that anybody who comes to our website can download this for free. But if you want to buy a hard copy, it's not too expensive. It's about $30 US, or maybe 30 British pounds. So what I wanted to do, really focus, is just tell you a little bit about the results and really look at the science policy in terms of what this means for policy and how it can actually contribute towards that dialogue. So let me start with, this is a presentation that I've been working with. I was doing PowerPoint one day, and my 16-year-old daughter said, you need to move on and start something new, and so she introduced me to this thing called Prezi. So I thought, well, maybe I'll try it, see how it is. So I think one of the things that we really are kind of grappling now is what is progress. And if you go to different people, different policymakers around the different parts of the world, I think they have very different answers. There is still not a common message in terms of what progress is, and we are all kind of grappling with it. Personally, I think at the very minimum, we'll need to have at two levels, one at the macro level and one at the micro, at the individual level. And I'm going to talk a little bit more at the macro level instead. And then the second is, how do we measure it? And in a sense, that old cliche, we manage what we can measure. And in a sense, that's why when we have GDP, we really manage it very well. But unfortunately, whether that is really what progress is about is being questioned as we get hit with all the triple crises, the economic crisis, the financial economic crisis, then we got the social crisis. It's also brewing up, coming out from disparity and inequality and poverty, growing poverty. And then, of course, I think many of you are here more in terms of sensitive to and sympathetic to is the environmental crisis. And these things just don't measure that. Anyway, the social and the environmental. So is it just economic growth and production, and can it be measured? For some reason, when Simon Kuznets kind of introduced the GDP and the measurement, he very, very early on said that this is not a measure of well-being and shouldn't be used as a measure of well-being. But precisely what he warned, the policymakers have not listened to. And they kind of pretty much sort of focus on GDP. And even if you look right now in all the measures that have been used to direct in terms of addressing the financial crisis, the economic crisis, it's still about economic growth. And somehow or rather they feel that once you have the economic growth, everything will be fine. Employment gets fine, social issues get well, and even the environment. So, but it really does not do that. And one interesting result that we found out, the JSSA is a Japan Sarayama Satoumi is a Japanese term for ecological landscapes. kind of co-chaired that science panel assessment. And the interesting thing, if you look at this, this particular graph here, you can sort of see a scissors effect where you change somewhere around 1980, where people actually had higher aspirations for spiritual affluence versus the material affluence. This is supported to a large extent by the work done by Estelin and others recently in terms of the whole issue of this happiness versus material affluence and stuff. I thought the number was a bit, it's not listed here, but Estelin comes out with about $10,000 to $15,000 per capita. At that point, people's aspirations for material welfare goes down. The marginal increase is very, very small versus the aspiration for spiritual and other values that they put on. So it's something that we really need to take into account when we really keep focusing on GDP. And then is it literacy, education? Well, I don't think we can dispute any of this. I think this is all very important. And if you look at those, you can very much already see the progression where we have the Human Development Index, which captures some of these in that particular index. And then there's this growing environmental movement, and in a sense, is it environmental security, biodiversity conservation? So you got all these things. So is it one or the other, or should be an integrated portfolio, if you might use that term? So I want to the Sarkozy initiative was an interesting initiative. It was chaired by Stiglitz and Amartya Sen, and the report was an interesting read, and then both of them produced then a book called Mismeasuring Our Lives, and it was a really nice book that I've nothing new. I think we all knew what they were saying, but I think they highlighted that we really need to address these particular issues, and they gave some good critical analysis about for GDP in terms of quantity versus quality and issues like that. So I think it's already moving towards that, and when you have two very prominent economists sort of saying like this is something that we need to really address, I think they kind of picked up the attention of many of the political leaders. And it's interesting, if you go to the Rio Plus 20 website, you can see what came out, and then you got David Cameron sort of saying GDP is something that we need to throw behind and we need to find new indicators. So these are the bastions of what I would call neoclassical economics, and already they are kind of questioning that. The UNSG, that's the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, a report on resilient people, resilient planet, which was their high-level panel report. And that calls for well-being, equity, and sustainability. But the interesting thing about this report, which I thought was very different from the usual UN reports, which always say this is what we need to do and stuff, is that this is the first time it was a UN report which says that we need a fundamental reform in the economic system. In most cases, they have always stayed away from that. They shied away because it was too strong a group to sort of say that you need a fundamental reform. But in this report, Ban Ki-moon did not mince his words. And he told his high panel to also not mince their words. And so they sort of say they need a fundamental reform in the economic system. You need to go beyond GDP indicators and stuff. I didn't put the real outcome because that was a little bit disappointing. So everybody said we need something, but then in the negotiations, the whole section on GDP was kind of really weakened quite substantively. So you sort of see the dichotomy and the conflict between the political reality and what I think the majority of people are calling for. So where do we go from here? I think the one thing that we need is a measure of progress in well-being. Now, what that well-being is, that's why in terms of the inclusive wealth, we kind of move away from that, trying to define what well-being is because it's so difficult and it's so context-driven. But it needs to have a measure of progress in well-being. The progress must be sustainable, so it's not just that for this particular generation, but also for future generations. So you have to have the issue of sustainability involved in that. The second is equity and distribution, because that's also very important in a sense to make sure that it's spread out evenly across the different segments of society. And then the fourth one, which I think is really important, is to reflect the trade-offs and synergies, the interdependency among all the different variables that we are taking. If you look at in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was in 2005, where they had various constituents of determinants of well-being, they identified trade-offs even among that, where people actually made a trade-off between material wealth and security, material wealth and health. And we have to take that account of those trade-offs. And there's also a trade-off among the determinants of well-being, the ones that actually contribute towards achieving those constituents. So what we're talking about is trying to get an indicator that comes from an integrated conceptual framework that captures the interdependencies, so that if you can sort of see that there is no free lunch here. If you want to really move towards for environmental conservation, you might have to make some trade-offs on the human constituents of well-being. But on the other hand, it also captures the fact that many of these ecosystem services contribute towards those well-being too. So you want a framework that captures those interdependencies, and I'll show in a little while in the next slide how the conceptual framework looks like for the IWR. So the IWR, the Inclusive Wealth Report, the origins are the Arrow and Dasgupta. That basically was a 2004 paper. Of course, it goes back much earlier than that. I think one of the first papers that really pushed this idea was the Dasgupta and Mailer paper in 2000, and even earlier than that. The IWR is based on the latest, the Arrow and Dasgupta et al. There are 3 other authors or 4 other authors in it, and it's really basically based on that framework. So we didn't sort of do any new, we kind of maybe improved the database, we improved some of the estimations, but in a way the methodology, the framework was identical to the Arrow and Dasgupta framework and model. The conceptual framework that we looked at is, so this is something that we kind of reflected the thinking behind the model that comes out from this framework. So you got the different capitals. You got the human, natural, social, and manufactured capital. Now, in this first report, 2012, we did not look at social capital. So basically, there are 3 capitals that were captured in this computation: natural, human, and manufactured capital. And so you get that going through an economic production process. I'm not sure if I have a highlighter, but this is where it's interesting in terms of the movement between the different capitals is actually mediated by what we call the shadow prices, and we'll talk a little bit about those shadow prices. In a recent special issue that came out from the Environment and Development Economics, that it's completely focused on, it was the June 2012. There's a whole paper by Dasgupta and others in that, and then there were a number of responses and critiques of that particular framework. And one of the things that emerged is that it's the strength of the framework, but as well as the Achilles heel of the framework is the estimation of those shadow prices. Market prices capture, in some perspective, some of those capitals, but not all of them. And how do we compute those shadow prices is a real challenge. And I think that's one of the areas of research that we highlight as one of the findings of this first report. And so we got the ways, goods and services. So waste goes through as a damage function, and the way that we captured that is through a climate damage function, CO2, and then that translates into a damage, which then goes back into the calculation of the inclusive wealth. Now, the mathematical model. I said I'm not going to talk about the mathematical model. What I'm going to put forward is 2 definitions and a proposition, which is what the Dasgupta paper does. The first definition is sustainability is achieved if change in well-being is positive. So that's a first definition, pretty straightforward. So if you have well-being positive, means you're getting your sustainability if you're focusing over the next in the future time period. The second definition is inclusive wealth. What is inclusive wealth of a country? It's the shadow value of its capital assets. So it's the shadow value, in a sense, it's the shadow price times the stock. And we talk about changes here. We don't actually really look at an absolute, but we are more focused on the changes. of the capital. So the inclusive wealth of the country, the change in the inclusive wealth, and what you see, that we report extensively is the change in those inclusive wealth rather than the absolute amount. Because we're more interested in seeing the change and how that change has had an impact across the different capitals. So it's the shadow value of all its capital assets. And the third is a proposition is that intergenerational well-being is positive if the changes in inclusive wealth is positive. And then we modify it by even sort of saying changes in inclusive wealth per capita is positive. And they prove the whole issuance of changing population. And it plays a very big role in the way those inclusive wealth estimates come out. And what we show is that without just having the actual changes in absolute terms of the inclusive wealth and see how countries are doing, performing towards sustainability, and then when you put in the population changes, the overall picture changes significantly. And so from a policy perspective, we're already sort of suggesting that in some countries, population policies have to be really looked at in terms of how that's going to have an impact over the future in terms of their wealth. So the scope of this first report, we did for 20 countries. Reasons are many, but the main reason is resources. It was meant to be a prototype. We wanted to test it, wanted to see what kind of reaction we got from the actual potential users. And if we got a good bite, then we thought then we'll move forward and maybe expand it. And based on what we have had received so far, we are now in the process of expanding this 20 countries to about another 40, so to about 60 countries. So if you look at those 20 countries, we've got a reasonable good spread of the regions. The ones in the green are the ones that we covered. We come back to GDP. But it sort of says it covers countries which are now producing 72% of the world's GDP. So these are the guys who are really having an impact on the world as it is right now. And 56 of the world's population live in these 20 countries. So to sort of see if overall, if these countries together as a group are on a sustainable track, or if they're not on a sustainable track, kind of gives an implication for the overall planet as such. And the time span was from 1990 to 2008. So what the arrow does Gupta paper does at all does is they did it for 5 countries, which is a subset of the 20 that we have. So we have expanded it by 15. And they did it for 5 years, and we did it for 19 years. So we have expanded the time horizon as well. So let me go into the results. So this is the inclusive wealth index, not per capita, just the absolute. This is the changes, the average annual change. And if you look at that, Russia's got negative. You've got country out in Nigeria, which is, I keep pointing to that, expecting it to be seen there. I guess many of you know where Nigeria is. Now the color is not coming out really well out here on this particular slide. But this has got a relatively pink, not as a green, but a pink, and that is a dark red mess. So Nigeria is between 0 and minus one, and then you got Russia out there, and then you got most of the countries. If you look, China and India are doing pretty well actually, and Kenya. Interesting. Canada is not doing so well. And then if you got the US is relatively okay. South Africa is all right. Chile is doing pretty well as well. So you got a funny change in if you sort of say how well a country is doing versus GDP. Over here, if you have the big players, you got actually China, India, Kenya, and Chile are the ones who are doing really well on the inclusive world. You got UK, Germany, and stuff who are not doing so well, and we've got Norway as well there. We didn't do Sweden. Right now, we are sort of saying that any country who wants to get involved, if they pay us $25,000, we'll do it for them. I'm just putting a leg. It's a public good, so it's available, it's free. So we just, I think Sweden is in the next batch of 30 countries. So this is just the IWI without per capita. Now, what intrigued me, and I thought I'll just follow up that storyline, is looking at Kenya. And so if you look at Kenya over here, this is how it is without per capita. So you got human capital is really been building up on human capital significantly. Its natural capital it's not doing too bad. I'm surprised because I lived 4 years in Nairobi, and I could see that they were really kind of deforesting quite a bit. But on the other hand, there has been massive afforestation programs under with the carbon sequestration and stuff. So surprisingly, they were not doing too bad on the natural capital. They weren't drawing down on their natural capital as we thought they would be. And then you can see the produced capital has been increasing quite linearly until about 2004, 2005, and then it started increasing exponentially. So quite a massive input of investment there. But natural capital, human capital has been increasing steadily. Now, the way we calculated human capital, it depends on a shadow price. The shadow wage or the shadow price of human capital is based on a number of variables, including mortality, gender distribution, working lifespan, as well as the number of the population also plays a big part. So you got more people in the educational level, that already pushes up the human capital a bit. So he said, okay, that seems interesting. Now, then what we did was then we sort of did the IWI per capita. Then you see some interesting things coming out here. So you got Russia actually doing a little better. Russia was the only country which had a negative population growth rate. I wouldn't want to speculate what's going on there, but something worth looking at. Either it's out-migration, maybe because of the collapse of the system, there's been a massive, I don't know. So, but they have a population decrease. So the population, the reduction in population has actually improved their situation. It still hasn't got them out of the red, but it's still there. Now if you look at Kenya, I have to see what the colors are here. So Kenya has kind of got a bashing from going from a really dark green to actually somewhere between 0.5 to 2, 0.5 to 0. So if you look at the Kenyan, so it's fine here because it's also, the color change has also been reflected in the key. So if you look at Kenya, it's kind of really changed significantly with the per capita. Same thing with South Africa. Venezuela as well. Chile has also moved a couple of notches down. These are countries with relatively high population growth rates. So if you look at the change per capita of the different capitals, you see that now what's happened is with the natural capital, it's actually been drawn down on a per capita basis. The whole portfolio of assets is called the productive base of the economy. So what this basically says is that the productive base of the economy is not growing as fast as the population growth rate is. So has a number of policy implications. First, a review of its population policy. Its population growth rate, I think, was at the higher end of 2.8 to 3%. That's the population growth rate. The interesting thing is, I think the regeneration of population growth rate is 2.2 to maintain. So this brings up some interesting issues for especially countries who really have a drop in their inclusive wealth, with a population growth rate of less than 2.2. So what are you saying? I think some of the inferences that we can draw on is that basically you already have a population which is too large for its productive base. You might need to have to review your population policy in kind of really reducing that significantly. I don't have for Japan, but Japan is an interesting example because of that very low population growth rate. They really do very well. And I'll show in a later quadrant where Japan is the only country which is sitting alone in a quadrant, the good quadrant. And it's an interesting example there. Because as far as if you look at it from a GDP perspective, they always call it the lost decade. Or in fact now it's the lost 2 decades. Another 5 years and you can sort of say it's the lost generation. So, but from the IWR, it tells you a very different picture. It's saying it's not actually a lost decade or so. And the second one is increased investment in natural capital. Because if you look at their natural capital per capita, it's been drawn down extensively. So from an investment perspective, if they're looking at their returns on investment, natural capital could be something that would provide those kind of high returns. Definitely increase investment in produced capital. Now, not many environmental proponents will like this statement because produced capital tends to always kind of cause some problems on the environment. Now, this is where, again, the shadow pricing basically captures that substitution rate. But again, I have to caution that we got to get those shadow prices correct. So the framework analytically is robust enough to capture that. Empirically, we have still a long way to go. So that's the produced capital. And then explore ways to increase return to investment in human capital. Now, the fact is, because of the massive number of the population itself has an impact on the human capital, I think in the next report, if you're going to be focusing on human capital, we will need to revise the methodology on calculating the human capital to filter out just the massive increase in people, in population. So to sort of qualify it a little bit more. Right now, in the present calculations, that's not being captured. So the fact that population increases automatically has a positive factor on human capital, and we need to qualify that in the next round of calculations. I just thought I'll look at Brazil as an example as well. And if you look at Brazil, the top graph is without per capita, and then the bottom graph is with per capita. And again, you see the natural capital really being drawn down when you go on a per capita basis. And in a way, it makes a lot of sense to really look at the per capita, because if you're taking the ecological footprint where they talk about people and the impact it has, this kind of tends to support that kind of analysis, and sort of say basically your productive base is really not keeping up with your population growth rate. Now for Brazil, some of the policy implications is, again, what we used to say, it might need to review the population policy because your population growth rate is only 1.9. But the base might be really high. So they might have to readjust the base population level downwards, and then have a 2.2 population growth rate to keep it regenerating at that level, but not to keep the 2.2 at the present level. So that's one implication from this particular result, is to bring down that base, and then from that base then start thinking about whether you want to have the 2.2. So in a way, this goes into a very sensitive area on population and demographics. And I think there was a very seminal report from the Royal Society just before Rio. I think it was also released in Rio by Sir or Lord Sutton, if I'm not mistaken his name. Sutton. I think it was a commission by the Royal Society in the UK. And they brought out a book. I think Patha was also involved in that group. And they brought out a report on population policies. And it was a pretty hard-hitting report where basically saying very similar conclusions from what we are drawing from the IWR. Two, we acknowledge there have been big increases in human capital. So we need to explore more targeted increases in human capital. So how do you want to really improve the next marginal return on an investment in human capital than what you have received before? Because they're already reaching diminishing returns on that increase in human capital. So in terms of technology, maybe higher levels of education, they'll need to explore into those avenues. Produce capital has been relatively constant, might need to be reevaluated to explore if increasing investment would produce increasing returns. Needs further analysis rather than just going ahead and building more infrastructure in Brazil. Natural capital has been drawn down, and question is if this can continue further. So this is a fundamental issue. And I think the authors, even in the Arrow paper as well, they sort of say we talk about sustainability, but in a sense we need to do further work to sort of say if this can be continued even in the future. So by looking at these trends, the question is, can this natural capital be drawn down? So this goes into what we call the second derivative in terms of seeing the rate of change. And if it is decreasing, then it's then time to actually start thinking about reinvestment in that particular capital. It's no longer being efficient to draw down on that capital, or in the other sense, to build up that capital. So just overall average annual growth in capital basis per capita. So these are for the different countries. And that's the produced capital. Shows how, the interesting thing is Venezuela, Russia and Nigeria actually saw a decrease in their produced capital, which means they're not replacing as fast as the depreciation rate. Buildings, roads, bridges, those kind of things that we computed in produced capital. Then we added on the human capital. So human capital in most countries have been positive, some really large. China is not so big, but look at Germany. We look at Brazil, and then even Brazil has been really huge. Ecuador has been really big. A lot of that has been over the last 5 years, but because we averaged it, it shows over the 19 years. But if we take over the time, you can see spikes over the last 10 years or so. And then that's the IWI. Now, we also did an adjusted IWI for a couple of, so what did we adjust it for? We adjusted it for total factor productivity. These are the exogenous changes, technology, things like that, which could have any implications on the IWI. So we added the total factor productivity from previous studies that have computed TFPs for different countries. Then we also did oil capital gains, because some of these countries are really huge fossil fuel producers, UK, Norway, Nigeria, Venezuela. So we basically adjusted for those oil capital gains. Countries which were exporting had an increase on their IWI. Those who were importing had a decrease, because those were things that they had to readjust because of oil exports or oil imports. And then the interesting one is on the damage function. We also adjusted it for for climate change and damage. This is another place where we took some very old figures from Nordhaus and Boyd and Richard Toll. I think it's time that we can actually improve those, and we will try to do that. So if you look at Kenya, the interesting thing is if you look at those colors, the blue, not the, I'm not sure, I'm kind of colorblind. I don't know what color this is. But this is the one which comes from climate change. So for Kenya, it's a huge hit with the climate change. So in a way that also talks about possibilities for policy in the international negotiations. This could be a powerful tool for some countries where they look, our inclusive wealth has been pretty good, but because of this global bad climate change, we are getting hit by that, and so we want some compensation. So this could be, I'm being devil's advocate here, but this could be used in negotiations by developing countries as a tool in terms of when they go to climate change, future climate change conferences. So here is a quadrant that I wanted to talk about. Average annual growth rates of I and natural capital. The 2012 was focused on natural capital. So if you look at it, Japan is the only country which had a positive growth in IWI. This is a growth in changes, and the growth in natural capital. So that growth in natural capital for Japan actually came from forests. They've been really reforesting significant amounts of land. And also there's been this resurgence of what when we did the assessment, is called the Satoyama landscapes. Basically, it's the traditional rural landscapes of Japan. And the government has been really pumping in a lot of money to rebuild those kind of landscapes. And so that gets captured through in the IWI. And that's one of the explanations that we can suggest why Japan is out there. Then the second one is where you have a negative growth in IWI and a negative growth in natural capital. So you get 6 countries coming out there. You got Russia, you got Venezuela, South Africa, Colombia, Nigeria, and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, basically 2 things. One is its capital gain oil, just huge drawdowns, which is not being reinvested in the other forms of capital. And then the other is a very high population growth rate. So that hits them, that's a double whammy for them, just gets hit. Venezuela, again, as I said, it's they haven't really been putting in a lot of the revenues from oil and into human capital has gone up. So in a sense, human capital is okay, but produce and natural capital has just been drawn down. And South Africa is also, South Africa, one of the biggest drivers is population again. Very high population growth rates. And then this brings in the rest, where you basically have the others who are positive on IWI, but negative on the natural capital. These countries basically have to question and sort of say, is this something that we can continue? And then for further analysis is to sort of see the rate and the rate of change in terms of, is the drawdown on natural capital being positive, or is it actually decreasing? And that will give them some indication whether they need to reinvest in natural capital or not, or they can continue still drawing down a little bit more. This is basically to sort of say that how do we then break up the natural capital? You got, these are the different components in the natural capital. You got cropland and pasture, you got forests. We tried fisheries. Fisheries was the first time we did that. Very difficult. Very difficult to get the data, but we had it for about 4 countries. Very small amounts. The contribution towards wealth was very small, but I think that's more of a data issue than anything else. And as more data comes available, I think we should be able to improve that. Fossil fuels, minerals, and then you got population and then natural capital per capita. What we would like to do actually is to basically break it up into 2 categories, renewables and non-renewables, and to see how that's been changing. It's just a matter of aggregating all the cropland, pasture, forests, and fisheries into one, and then keep the fossil fuels separate. And that's for Brazil, the breakdown of natural capital. And if you look at that, minerals, they've been kind of really going on their minerals. Agricultural land, they have been improving, well, going into soya and all that stuff. And then forest reserves have been going down. But if you look at it, it's interesting, the rate of change of the forest, the green line, versus the agricultural land. It's not a very good sign for environmental conservationists, because basically what it's saying is that if you look at that slope there, it's really producing a lot more in terms of what's coming out from agricultural land, the conversion. But I would still want to do a little bit more analysis before I come out and say that. But you've already caught me on the video, so. But it's something that is worth investigating a bit further. And then fossil fuels is not really that critical for Brazil. It's a very small amount. So the main thing for Brazil to look at is the rate of drawdown of its natural capital, of forest resources, versus the rate of increasing agricultural land. So what did we do here? Basically, we wanted to sort of see, as I told you, the rate of change, or what we call the second moment or the second derivative. And what we're sort of saying is that if the drawdown on natural capital over time, is it increasing or is it decreasing? And in the case for Norway, basically the drawdown of natural capital is still decreasing versus the other forms of capital. But the one that we really wanted to look at is the blue line, which is the natural capital. Look at for the UK. If you kind of fit the curve on that blue line, you basically get where it is actually increasing. So the drawdown of natural capital, the rate of return on the drawdown of natural capital was increasing, and then it turned around in 1998 to 2000, where that rate then changed, and it was increasing positive. So in a way, it was really making good sense for the United Kingdom to actually increase its forest reserves. That's what, if you break up the natural capital, it's forest reserves that they were increasing quite substantively. So insights from the report. First, are we consuming too much of our productive base, looking at all the different forms of capital? Can we sustain our current lifestyle? For some countries you can say yes, and for some, like I think 30% of the countries we assess, not really, they're already negative. And out of that, out of the 70%, I would say about 60% of that 70% are already at the margin, and that they will not be able to continue the way that they've been behaving. 3, where investments are needed to strengthen the productive base. The one that we would like to do a lot more work is looking at that second rate and to sort of see how the transformation rates are. This is one of the issues that Bob Solow, in his response to the Arrow et al. Paper, was in terms of, can we get a handle on the rate of substitution and the rate of transformation among the different capital asset bases. So what did we do in Rio Plus 20? The IWR launched at a UNEP UNU IHDP side event. We got actually on The Economist, I'm not sure what date, this was sometime in 30th, or was it on July? And if you can read it, it's the second one called The Real Wealth of Nations. And it was an interview, I think it was under the free exchange section of The Economist. It was an interview with Partha. And so it was on The Economist, and then for a couple of weeks it was on The Economist blog as well. And we did a kind of count, and we kind of found out that we were the most featured publication within the Rio 20 reporting, so that was nice. And then, you know, we got presented in the Post, Time magazine, and others. So the next IWR is, we hope to bring it out in 2014, later part of 2014. It's either human capital or social capital. 2015 is going to be the review of the MDGs. And so we hope to bring this out in time for that review, which will actually influence and guide the discussions that are going to go on that. And human capital or either social capital will be an important element in those MDGs review. Next step, this is our grand vision, establishment of an inclusive wealth center, sponsored by multiple UN agencies and countries. The reason we say multiple UN agencies is that one of the things that we really try to emphasize is that this is not an environmental indicator. This is an indicator that should be used primarily by multiple constituencies, including planning agencies, finance agencies, aid development agencies and stuff. So by having just one UN sponsor, i.e. if we're talking about just UNEP, I think we might lose the audience of the broader audience. So we want to have this sponsored by multiple UN agencies and countries. The idea here is for the IWC is not to do the actual complete research. What it will do, it will focus on computing the wealth as we did here, but then set feelers out into the natural capital network and sort of request inputs, especially in the form of shadow prices and even maybe the stocks like fisheries. What kind of stocks that do we have and the changes in the stocks, and then trying to get those shadow prices for the different. And I think the shadow prices that we really want to improve is the shadow prices of the non-timber forest products, the regulating services of forests, water regulating, water purification and stuff. And I think what we have right now is really old and is really underestimated. The key challenges, again, I keep emphasizing estimating shadow prices, some of the methodological issues with natural capital, the typology that we have, the typology that was introduced, especially for ecosystem services, by the Millennium Assessment doesn't lend itself well for economic valuation. There's a lot of double counting and stuff. So that needs to be a lot of work. I think Turner and Fisher, or Fisher and Turner tried to, I think they did attempt for typology, but it also came under a lot of criticisms. So there's a lot of work to be done, both at basically the typology of natural capital and what does it constitute and the services, and then doing the shadow prices and then estimating the total natural value of natural capital. Human capital, a lot of work, especially with the health. I didn't talk about health, but Dasgupta and Arrow, they did health and we did health, but it was so huge that it just basically shadowed everything else. And so we have a separate section on health and says what that was, but it's something that we need a lot more work on. And then social capital, and then I think the one that we really want to do is the financial capital, because that's a really major issue these days in terms of countries' debt. And there was an interesting blog on the Time magazine on the IWR and in terms of debt, and that kind of gave us an idea of we need to start looking at financial capital. Another idea that we're thinking of is doing an IWI for companies, because they basically are capital asset bases. So valuing, sort of saying how a company is doing based on the inclusive wealth rather than just their sales or profits or net profits. Thank you.